Welcome back. In this video, we are going to set up all the controls for the size, shape, and water level for our puddles, as well as a couple of additional controls. So that seems like quite a lot, but luckily for us, it's all pretty simple and similar to what we've done before with one exception, and that is using drivers. So let's go into our node group, and first of all, let's address a little issue that we have with our mud. If we go to our water level and we take our water level up quite a bit, you can see that as we start seeing some of the land, it's actually lower than our water. Now this is an issue that's been present in our material for a while now, and it's not something I've addressed yet. So originally we had our height map coming out of this float curve node in our original displacement frame. But then we adjusted it using this displacement top adjustment, and we mixed it back into our displacement here. So now instead of using this float curve in our less than, we actually want to be using this mix node. So this should fix the issue and our issue disappears. Now we could use this also in our color ramp here and this color ramp, but I think I'm just going to leave that for the moment because I do like the effect it's given us just now. Now that we've fixed the issue that we had with our water level and our displacement, it's time to start working on the other water controls that we need. So first of all, I'm just going to grab this group input and move it a little bit closer to our water level frame, and that's going to allow us to work a little bit easier. Now you can see that we don't have an input for our value node. Ideally, we'd like to just click and drag a noodle straight onto this node to change that value, but we're not able to do that because this node only has an output, it does not have an input. The easiest way to add an input here is just to click on the plus icon up on your inputs section here. You can see it's duplicated at low B. We can click this down arrow to move that down. We'll change it to a float, and then we'll just rename this water level. Now, as our default, we want to use 0.2, which is the value that we used throughout this material. Our minimum is going to be 0, and our maximum is going to be 1. Now, as yet, we still don't have a way to connect that. We're going to do that using drivers. So the easiest way to do this is just by tabbing out. We're going to find our new water level control on our node group. We're going to right click. We're going to choose copy as new driver, and then we'll tab back into our node group, find the value that we want to connect this driver to. We're going to right click and paste that driver. So now we have a value here which is highlighted in this kind of purplish pink color, and if we come back at our node group, you can see that we have a water level of 0, and as we increase this, you should see our water is now increasing in our material. Let's just zoom out a little bit so that's a little bit easier to see. We'll increase this up and we'll take that to 0.2 again. We'll just type that value in. We'll tab back into our material and you can see that value has updated within water level. So that's essentially the way that we can change the value within any node, whether it has an input for that particular value or not. Now just zooming back in on one of these puddles, and let's just try and increase that value again. Now, as I increase that up, you can see nothing's changing on the render. And when we click off of that, you can see it resets back to 0.2. We can no longer change this value within the node group. We can now only change that through its driver, which is this water level control outside the node group. So if we take our water level and we increase it a little bit more, what you'll find is our dispersion no longer works. We are getting the same exact transparency values or fake transparency values as we were getting with a water level of 0.2. And if we decrease this all the way down, even though the mask is covering it, this same dispersion will remain no matter how much water we have. So what we have to do is we have to use that driver to also drive a different value. Now if you look at our water level, the driver that we use to control this is actually in this color ramp node. So if we look at our areas of fake dispersion, let's just look from the top down. You can see that quite clearly here where we have this really dark brown area and these light brown areas. If we change this black flag down a little bit, you can see that increases And we'll put that back, and if we increase that, you can see we now remove that. So let's just undo a couple of times to change those values back to where they were. Now, if we use a value of 0.2 in here, it's obviously not going to be working correctly because our color ramp at the moment says 0.131. And remember, this is the value we used when the water level was at 0.2. But what we can do is we can use something called a scripted expression to change this value based on our driver. So once again, we'll add a driver. We'll make sure we're clicked on this black flag. We'll right click on our position and we're going to paste that driver. But this time we're going to do something a little bit different. We are going to right click and edit the driver. And when we do that, we get this little driven property window that will appear. Now we want to change from the type average value to scripted expression. This gives us this expression box, which at the moment just says default value, which is essentially any value that we already have, which at the moment is 0.330. And if you move off that, you can always click on edit driver again. Now we want to get a value that's around about 2/3 of our default value. The easiest way to do that is just by multiplying this by 0.66. We'll hit that there. Our black flag will move slightly. Now all we have to do is we have to change the white flag. So this is going to be a little bit tricky. We can just click here to move to our white flag. This is the flag number. And you can see our position there is 0.211. So 0.211 is around about 105% of our default value. So with our white flag selected, we will right click on this, we'll paste our driver, we will edit the driver, we'll change from type average value to scripted expression. And what we want to do here is we want to multiply this by, let's say, 1.05. And we'll hit return, we'll go back to our color ramp, and now you can see we have our black flag and our white flag separated again. And if you look at our fake dispersion now, it looks much better for the water level that we have. So let's just do a couple of tests. We'll tab out of our node again, and we'll just decrease this water level a little bit. And you can see as we decrease that, our dispersion follows along. We'll make this pretty low, and you can see our dispersion is still working. We'll make this much higher, and you can see just as our land disappears, we get a little bit of that dispersion, and then it disappears when we raise our water level a little bit more. So now our water level controls are completely working. Now, one other thing that we might want to change in our water level is the shape and size of our puddles. So at the moment we have this displacement section here, and this is where we have all our puddles set up. Now, in order to get these puddle shapes, we used this Voronoi texture. And in order to make our Voronoi texture a little bit more interesting, we distorted its vector coordinates using this texture map node. And the way we mix that distortion in is using the factor in this linear light node. So at the moment we have a value of 0.44 in there. If we take this factor all the way down, you'll see we actually now get these rounded puddles. We've undistorted that Voronoi texture and we've got its default kind of pretty round puddle shapes. If we increase this factor way past 0.44, you can see that we get much more distorted puddles. So now we can actually use this factor under linear light as our puddle shape input. So let's just grab this group input, move it down, and we'll take this factor and we'll plug it straight into our group input. We'll change the name of that to puddle shape, and we'll stick with the default of 0.44 and the min-max of 0 and 1. Okay, so it's time for a little challenge. Your challenge for this video is to add controls for adjusting the puddle size. So we've just added controls to adjust the shape of the puddles, and use what you've learned there to see if you can figure out where we can change the puddle size. Once you've done that, add appropriate default, minimum and maximum values, and then finally test your new puddle size setting from the node group. Pause the video, have a go at that, and join me in a moment and I'll show you how I would do it. Okay, so how did you get on with that challenge? Did you figure out where to change the size of these puddles? So I'm just going to tab out here and we have our puddle shape at 0.44. That's absolutely fine. Now where I would change the size of the puddles is where this Voronoi texture actually gets mixed into our displacement map, and that's through this multiply node. So at the moment we have a factor of 0.88. If I decrease that down, you can see our puddles pretty much disappear. If I move this way up, our puddles seem to get a lot bigger. Now it's a lot more obvious when our puddles aren't quite as distorted, but this is the value that we're essentially using to increase or decrease the influence of this Voronoi texture. So let's grab this group input and just move it a little bit closer so it's a bit easier to work. So we'll plug that in there, and now we just have to make sure we select that and give it a meaningful name, which is going to be puddle size. And once again, I'm just going to stick with the default of 0.88 and the minimum and maximum of 0 and 1. Now the last thing I want to do here is give some controls for the puddles themselves when it comes to the ripples. So let's just get a little bit of a better angle here. We can see this puddle quite nicely and we can see those ripples on the surface. Now we have our wave texture here, which has a scale. So this is going to be the first setting that we want to plug in. This is going to be our puddle scale. And we'll stick with the default of 50. The minimum for this I think we'll set to 0, and the maximum I think we'll be safe at around about 100. And the next thing we want to do is how strong this influence is. So just like with puddle size, we want to use the mix node where this is mixed into our bump map. So after map range, you can see that we have this mix node here. Let's just move some things out of the way a little bit so it's a little bit clearer. And we're using this factor. Now at the moment this is 0.001, and this is not a great value to be using as our default. It's just far too small to be useful. But what we can do is we can use a math node to make this a much easier value to work with. So let's just grab this factor, plug it into this bottom slot. This is going to be our ripple strength. And in fact, let's change that other name from puddle scale to ripple scale, because I think that is actually even more meaningful. So before we get to ripple strength, ideally, we don't want our default value to be 0.001 for this level of the effect. So let's grab a converter math node. We'll plug this in before, and we'll use a divide. In this case, let's take a value of, let's say, 1000. So we're setting our divide node to a value of 1000. So if we come out of this now and we have a ripple strength of 0.001, we basically don't see anything because we're taking this value and we're adding even more zeros between the decimal point and the 1 because we're dividing. But if we take this ripple strength to 1, you can see we essentially get the same kind of strength as we had before. Now, because we had a maximum of 1 in there, we can't actually make this any bigger just by sliding this. We can only go between 0 and 1. So we might want to tab in there and just change this default max to something like 5 instead. And that just gives us a little bit more leeway to make these ripples even stronger if we need to. In the next video, we're going to add the last couple of controls to break up our mud and just adjust the displacement map. I'll see you then.